So we'll start our conversation.
Yes. I want to also say thank you to Chandra and Anne for inviting me, and of course to Alicia, who is a mentor from afar for me, because I did all my training in Washington State, but it was really your wisdom that was disseminated to me. So I feel like I'm part of the fruit as well of this tree. So thank you so much, Alicia. And it's such a pleasure to get to talk about this particular topic. The notion of psychoanalytic thought is quite fraught. People have strong opinions about it as an overall arching theory. And so I thought, we would talk a little bit about why people would want to avoid it, why people would want to push it away. And there's gobs of reasons. The Freudian tradition in particular was enormously patriarchal, enormously Eurocentric, not interested in what the wider context of other people's ways of knowing and being in the world. I know Chandra's going to talk with us more about that later. And I think for our purposes, one of the things that psychoanalysis did not have access to and got really quite wrong was the developmental capacities of the infant. That originally the idea was the infant was kind of in this bubble and only subject to their own kind of fantasy life, and that the social environment was seen rather darkly through this protective bubble. We, of course, know that's not true. There's so much incredible, important evidence of the social apparatus and desire of infants to connect right from birth. And so we've really leaned into that. More modern analytic thinkers, Dan Stern, Beatrice Beebe, and others have really helped us understand and start to integrate some of these ideas. So, there's a lot, if you think about the baby in the bathwater, there's a lot of bathwater when it comes to psychoanalysis. Do you want to say anything more about that before we go into the baby part?
Well, it's interesting, Lisa. Right before meeting here, Lisa and I were on the wonderful 4th floor, and Lisa came up with the idea of the baby and the bathwater, and I said, what do you think is the bathwater? And what do you think is the baby? And we decided that we would be talking a little bit about what the bathwater is. And I think personally that the bathwater can be seen as the incredibly esoteric theoretical formulations. But under the esoteric theoretical formulations, there is always a core that resonates to me with the human experience. And I think for me, what psychoanalysis brings, and why I would urge you to read at least the more palatable versions, the more user-friendly texts of psychoanalysis, is that psychoanalysis does not look away from the darkness. The revolution that Freud created continues to be, I think, unappreciated. And I don't want to make a treatise out of this. I want this to be a dialogue, and I realize that I can go on and on and on. But I just want to say that, he really started by talking about sex and aggression. And in Victorian Europe, sex and aggression, are you kidding? That was all behind closed doors where there were debaucheries, but nobody spoke about it. And when we look at our own society today, we are bombarded by media that says sex, 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 aggression, 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 aggression. That's what fuels the social discourse and the media. And what Freud wanted was to make it speakable and make it containable, socialize it by acknowledging that it had enormous destructive power. And I think that we are dealing with its enormous destructive power right now. And I think he also then talked about, given the enormous power of these drives, how do people manage it? How do they manage the fear that their sexual drives and their aggressive drives are going to be censored by society so that they need to go underground? And then he came up with the concept of defenses and the anxiety that is created when our drives meet reality. And we are told from the very beginning, no, you cannot touch yourself, no, you cannot bite your brother. And it's like, but I want to. How do I manage that? The one thing and not being able to. And he said, by looking at it, feeling it, then you have more flexibility to choose a response, right? And so I think that that's what keeps us coming to the baby. Yeah.
The integration of the darkness into our waking self. You know, he talked about the id and the ego and the superego, the shame, right, of the superego and its need for recognition in the social realm, and then of course the id, all this darkness. And we don't really necessarily have to use those terms all the time, but it's really important to see the wisdom of the fact that we can have a very fractured experience of ourselves. And we can have ideas and wants and impulses that are in conflict with each other. And the hope of integration so that we can think about our feelings and feel about our thoughts in an integrated way is the beauty of a more psychoanalytic approach that doesn't, some of the more modern approaches to counseling, which are very cognitive based, you know, are can be very helpful. And I think of them for the therapist, the experience is more like the patient has a lock, which is the problem, and you're trying to provide the key, which is the solution. And that can sometimes happen and be really important. But it's a lot of pressure for a therapist. And the psychodynamic approach, I would say, is more like a prism, where you're turning and turning and turning and looking through all the different angles to try to have a more integrated understanding of these dark, difficult, strong impulses that we can have, and also our need to be a social human. So you mentioned the notion of defenses. Before we get to that, I think it's really important to acknowledge something that I think in popular culture is well acknowledged, but maybe not given its due, which is the unconscious. And Freud's notion that we can all be and all are motivated by aspects of our existence that we're not consciously aware of is genius and a really, really important piece of understanding and working with families. Do you want to say more about the unconscious?
Yes, let's talk with each other. One of the granddaughters of Freud just died, She was a social worker, and she said that she was not a Freudian, but that we have awareness of about 5% of our motivations, and all the rest is what you called a subterranean river that feeds, waters that 5% that is over the surface. Is a little bit like an iceberg also, right? And I think that the discovery of the unconscious is another extraordinary contribution that Freud made, that I think is becoming more and more expanded as we understand the molecular basis, the biological basis, the genetic basis, the epigenetic basis of who we are, how biological we are, and how biologically driven to respond in particular ways to the environment, which then responds to us, and we create this tapestry of influences. And I think that's one of the, I love Dante Cicchetti, because in developing developmental psychopathology as a field that encompasses the world, he put psychoanalysis there with genetics, with biology, with anthropology, with trauma theory, with developmental theory, but he put psychoanalysis there as a particular discipline that needed to be part of how we understand humans. And I think that what the unconscious is the part of ourselves that is fueling perceptions, attitudes, feelings, impulses, but that we are not aware of. And I think that what psychoanalytically informed practice and child-parent psychotherapy wants to do is try to put together, how do things flow? How did your past how does your past continue to influence how you are responding to your baby, how you are responding to your partner, how you are responding to yourselves? And I think that the cataclysmic fears that Freud talked about, which are really developmental fears, right? The fear of being abandoned, the fear of not being loved, the fear of being hurt, which he called castration anxiety because he was so focused on his own issues. But that we know, when we look at 18-month-olds, they don't want to have their nails cut, they don't want to be toilet trained, they don't want to have their hair cut, and different babies have different attitudes. Some of them are much more blasé about it, and others are really determined that no, you are not going to, take out their mocos from their noses, etc. Leave me alone. I want all of me here, And the fear of, I'm bad, there's something intrinsically wrong with me that makes me deserve to be heard, deserve to be left, deserve not to be loved. And those convictions are just extraordinarily powerful, but they are unconscious. And I think that it takes the translation of the clinician many times to make them conscious, and the enormous relief that parents have and that children have, right? When we kindly, gently, supportively say, do you think it's your fault that your daddy left? And I think that's why I think that this part of psychoanalysis is the baby, right?
Yeah. I was going to say also about just in thinking about the unconscious from this level of the infant, that the work that more recent analytically informed folks have done really helps us take an idea like the internal working model of how it goes between me and you, really from the very first weeks and months. The back and forth of when I smile, what happens to your face? Do you smile and lean in, or do you avert your gaze? When I am distressed, what do I see on your face? This is all so well before language, but is laying down a feeling state in the baby that translates into an adaptation to my caregiver. I need you so desperately. You are my entire world. How do I flex my behavior in these subtle ways? And Beatrice Beatty is somebody you should read if this is interesting material to you, so that I can get as comfortable as possible, given that this is our relationship. And that, in my mind, that is some of the foundational layers of the unconscious. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Before some of these more, the other cataclysmic ideas, or my understanding, and maybe you can help us understand this better, is that those 4 ideas of Freud's are quite developmentally oriented. So really we're talking about this first stage, which is the fear of being left, the fear of separation, which is this newborn, this new baby is like, I need you to come to me, right? So they're quite adapted to making those subtle shifts in the interaction to try to manage this relationship. You come too close to me and I quickly avert my gaze to help me re-regulate. But then if you pull away, I need to come back because you can't leave me, right? So this subtle back and forth is really the kind of that first of the cataclysmic fears.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Right.
And then the others come online a little bit more developmentally. You talked about the body integrity piece being like really there for the toddler, right? Yeah. And shame is the fear of not belonging. I think that's one of the first ones. Do you want to talk about that one a little bit?
Shame is such an enormous presence. And I think that we tend to underestimate the shame of parents who come to work with us. One of the applications of child-parent psychotherapy is called attachment vitamins. And it's a group oriented way of talking with parents about attachment, stress, and trauma. And the way that we begin is by asking parents, can you talk about a moment last week where you really felt connected with your baby? And the body language of the parents that are referred by Child Protective Services or by, the agencies changes so fast when we ask them that. Because from here, like, what are you going to scold me about? What are you going to tell me that you think I need to do? It goes to, oh, you think that you are starting from taking for granted that I am connected with my baby. And I think underneath that shift is the addressing of the shame, that they are coming with this sense of, I am someone who is not perceived as good enough by the society, by somebody that needs to be fixed, which of course goes, I think, derives its power from the fact that when they were 3 years old and 4 years old and 5-year-olds were told, stop doing that, you are not good, you are bad, etc. So that the message has always been there's something wrong with me. And so this shame, I think it's something that this sense of, do I belong? And why don't I? And what is intrinsically wrong with me is such an important thing, I think, to be aware of when we first approach parents, and to keep aware of, because it comes up again and again, regardless of how good our relationship with them is, because it's so deeply rooted.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how to talk with parents and how to name that thing that is so painful for them to hear, which is, he's doing his best, but I'm worried that he sometimes feels like he's a bad kid. And that can be a powerful moment for a parent, because we all resonate with what it feels like to worry that in some level we're bad, and you can explain that children are doing the very best they can with very limited information. And they make these kind of huge assumptions because they're little and they have these few really important things that they're trying to feel okay about. And one of them is, am I a good boy or am I a bad boy? Right? And it's definitely a moment where I think gently put brings a lot of empathy from a parent usually.
Mm-hmm. And there, I think that, you like Peter Fonagy a lot. And Peter Fonagy has a wonderful book called What Works for Whom? And it's like 500 pages. And you can just scan it and get a sense of it. But essentially, it says not everything works for everybody. And so we need to figure out what works for whom, right? And Selma Freiberg, who is, on her shoulders we stand, right? Generation after generation after generation. She talked about start with simplicity. And by simplicity, she meant if the parent can respond to the lovely explanation that you gave about your child is doing the best he can, and he doesn't have the resources to stop himself from breaking the eggs one after the other because they are so fun to see them splashing on the floor. But it's not because he wants to bite you. It's because, can you imagine the drama of shoo, shoo, shoo? And the parent says, I never thought of that. Then you have one kind of parent that is ready for that benevolent explanation. Yeah. And then you have another kind of parent whose defenses are more entrenched. And I remember a mom that shaped me, one of my first families, who said to me, she said to me, that baby at 3 months old, will you believe that she jumped from her crib to my bed to breastfeed and then jump back again into her crib? And I said, what makes you think that she did that? And she said, because my breasts were totally empty this morning. And they're usually very full. And I said, could it be that there might be other explanations? And we went on in this way for a while, and I said, and she was just adamant about it. And she said, she is a sneaky kid, and I know she did it. And then in the morning, she had this little smile, like, I fooled you. And you can imagine, what do you do there, right? And I said, well, excuse me, but I just have a hard time imagining her doing that, because if you ever seen her do that, like in the morning, I just don't think she has the capacity physically to do that. And she said, hi, Alicia, you and your developmental theories. I know my kid. And so, and so I think that's a different kind of parent.
That is a different kind of parent, for sure. You're reminding me actually of one of my very first cases. These first cases just really live with you. And
Yes.
this was a mother who's, speaking of primitive aggression, was made quite ill by her pregnancy, physically feeling very terrible. And her idea was that the baby was doing this to her intentionally. And she was actually observed in her OB appointment hitting her belly in retribution to the baby for making her feel so ill. And, that's a level of disturbance that would not be able to be receptive to. But I tried, I'll tell you, I tried many times.
I'm sure you did.
Yeah.
I'm sure you did.
I was so taken with Selma's ideas in this case, where this was a mother who I saw her through quite a bit of her pregnancy and then for years after, and she never once referred to the baby as like a person, almost never referred to her pregnancy, and so self-absorbed with her own grievance and her own trauma. And there was something where I felt like, oh, finally I've made a little bit of progress when she talked to the baby in her belly closer to the delivery after some treatment. She said, I don't want you to have some negative experience. I couldn't remember what it was. And I just thought, oh, thank God, at least she's able to mentalize that there is this little human there that's not just a demon. So it felt like a little bit of a step, forward.
And did you get there, Lisa, by helping her think of what life was like for her as she was growing up?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was kind of textbook Ghosts in the Nursery, honestly.
Yes.
Lots and lots of, please, that you didn't deserve that to happen to you. That was terrible. A young child shouldn't have to deal with these things.
Yes.
How lonely you must have been.
Yes.
And she was quite rejecting of those comments. So it was going on faith that these little drops of empathy could penetrate, and they started to, enough that she was able to start to really think about her child as it's his own person. It was very difficult treatment for a long time, so I don't want to say it was a miracle, but there was progress.
Yes.
A tiny bit of softening in her incredibly hard defense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that the reason I asked you whether you got there by talking about her, what happened to her as she was growing up and her pain, is that, we did not write this in Don't Hit My Mommy. We talk a lot about the triangle, right? And we talk about the triangle for the baby. And more, I think that before we do a triangle for the baby, we need to think of a triangle for the mother and for the father and for the family. Because more and more is the family as a container. What happened to the family What was the historical trauma of the family? What are the current circumstances of the family? And how does that lead to the travails that they are experiencing in the here and now? And how can we help think of the things that have helped them, who has helped them, what has helped them, what are the things that make them feel strong and good and loving, and how can we grow that? And I think that starting with that makes it easier for the parents to go into, given that this happened to the baby, of course it's so understandable that your child is doing this and this and this, and then have the triangle built in. And for the mom that I was talking about, the one who said you and your developmental theories, she also did not want this baby. And this baby was a reminder of all the siblings that she had to take care of when she was 8 and 9 and 10, and she wanted to be a kid. And I don't know what happened to the mom that you are talking about, but I would imagine that something pretty tough must have happened. And you wanted to talk about projective identification, right? And I think that this is a perfect example of that. Do you want to go in that direction?
Yeah, projective identification is such a powerful idea whereby the unacceptable, and I think Chandra's going to talk more about this, the unacceptable, terrible feeling and idea that cannot be comfortable in me has to be projected out to another person. And so that's projection. And then the identification part is when you unconsciously receive the projection and start to act in a way that's consonant with the thing I'm trying to get rid of. I'm not the one who's aggressive, and I'm projecting my aggression into you, and you start to feel like, come on, let's hurry up with this, you know, a little prickliness. That's what you're thinking. And oh my gosh, for this family, I think was the one I'm talking about, victim of projective identification over multiple generations, right? So the second of her 2 children was the one that she really projected her aggression into, and he became extraordinarily aggressive and disturbed child. Yeah, so it's quite a toxic and difficult thing to necessarily know is happening. But I would say from a therapeutic standpoint, that moment of saying, boy, I have a really strong feeling right now. Is this a typical feeling for me to have in this moment? Is there something happening here that I'm picking up from what some people call the inner subjective field? That you're sending something in my direction. And it might be something as simple as sleepiness. I mean, have you ever felt really, really tired in a session? And that might be the result of what's going on in your life or where you are in your day, but it also might be something that's being passed back and forth about a certain kind of deadness or an expectation that my partner, on part of your client, that my partner is not really alive and attentive to me, right? So their affect becomes flatter and more droning because they have an expectation that you're not interested. And then you find yourself kind of withdrawing because you're sleepy. Have you ever had that happen?
Oh yes, you just brought back a memory that was really transformational for me. When I was a postdoctoral student at the University of Michigan, and I was working with a young woman that I really loved. And I kept falling asleep as she talked to me. And I was so deeply ashamed of that. I didn't actually fall asleep, but I kept really feeling so tired. And in supervision, I said to Dr. Joseph Adelson, a marvelous supervisor. I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but I feel so tired with her when I'm with her, and I really love her, and I really want to help her. This was a young woman who had severe diabetes, and she was incredibly self-destructive. She drank a lot. She ate everything that she could not eat, she should not eat. And it was like saying, dare me not to die. And I was so overwhelmed by a feeling of responsibility for her survival and by a feeling of helplessness about making a difference, that I think I just wanted to get into this cozy little safe sleep where I did not need to notice that this was happening to her. And it is in supervision when Dr. Adelson kind of guided me through and put the points together that I woke up.
And you found yourself being more attentive and alive.
Much more attentive, but also much more incisive in calling her on what she was doing, because I was under the impression that I needed to be unconditionally empathic and unconditionally listening to her and supporting her and etc. And I did not realize that she actually needed somebody saying, I'm really desperately worried about you. I think that you're hurting yourself. Where does that impulse to hurt yourself come from? So that it was speaking the unspeakable many years ago that led to that, and I think that's what psychoanalysis gives to us. It says, I was afraid of saying it. And what psychoanalysis says is there is nothing that cannot be felt. There are no taboos to thinking and feeling in the sphere of the therapeutic encounter. You cannot act on it. You cannot go enact your impulses. There is a reality there. You need to think of the consequences, but you have permission, you have freedom to feel and freedom to think and freedom to reflect and freedom to speak. And the clinician needs to also have that freedom in a respectful manner.
You think that's right? I'm thinking also about parents and children and this intersubjective field, the projection of an expectation that you're going to be like everybody else that's been important to me. So as clinicians, that we are the receivers of that expectation on these very quiet and often unverbalized ways, and how important it is for us to always hold in mind that that might be happening and ask ourselves, what am I doing, thinking, receiving that's particular to this moment, particular to this client, so that we can pick up on their expectations and then decide, do I want to give them a new experience, just like you did with your client? Do I need to start to shift their ideas about, their unconscious ideas about what interpersonal relationships can bring? And that's often a really important piece of therapy, and often what we're kind of trying to support parents to do with their kids, because when they come to us and the child is having all kinds of behaviors that are upsetting to the adults in the world, and we're thinking very much about what is the system that's in place, what is the unconscious rules about how this dyad or triad interacts, what they expect from each other, that can help us see what's keeping this behavior in place? It's what's sort of locking the system in place? And where can we start to have an impact by shifting the expectations about how it goes? Yeah.
And I think often we can do that by, Winnicott talked about how therapy is play, and I never quite understood until relatively recently what he meant by that, therapy as play. And I think what he means is letting our imagination free and play with the possibility of a range of feelings. Play with hypotheses, if you wish. And I think that something that we can model for parents is that idea of playing with possibilities. Could it be? Do you think it's possible? Well, 8-month-olds, do you think it's possible that so and so? And I think that one thing in child-parent psychotherapy that we like to do is play with what is the agenda that the parent is being driven by, and what is the agenda that the child is being driven by, and where do they converge in what Bowlby called a partnership that is aligned around shared goals, which happens maybe about 30% of the time with toddlers, for example. And when is there like a clash? And it happens often, for example, at the end of a session, right? When the child does not want to leave and the parent has to go and the therapist has to go. And the idea that for this child, it is heaven to have the beloved parent and the very liked therapist paying attention to them. Why would they want to leave? And the parent needs to go home and make dinner or go to work or whatever, and the therapist needs the next client, etc. And so kind of playing with the idea that, of course, he doesn't want to go. And this is reality. And that, again, we go back to psychoanalysis, right? Is desire versus reality. How do you acknowledge it? How do you reconcile with it? How do you find a way of making it palatable, like giving a little pebble as a transitional object, and here, this will remind you that next week we're gonna play again, and then making the separation more bearable.
Yeah. Well, so maybe we touched on the transference piece a little bit through projective identification. So we're thinking about the behaviors that often show up in the clinical room, in the home, that it's really important for us as clinicians to understand them as defenses against the anxieties that you mentioned, particularly the anxieties around not being loved, about belonging and not being left. And maybe, so we see kids who are withdrawn, we see kids who are aggressive. We see kids who are parentified or role reversed, who are taking very good care of their parents. And we see kids who are very coy. I think that talking about identification of the aggressor is so central to the work that we do, because so many of the kids that we see are coming with problems of aggression, or if they're not, will often bring aggression into the play. And so maybe we could spend some time talking about identification with the aggressor.
Okay. Identification with the aggressor. You see why it's not fun to get into the psychoanalytic jargon, right? identification with the aggressor, projective identification, transference, countertransference. These are big words. They really are clunky. And it's like learning a new language. And I just want to say but I think that what you and I want to convey is don't let yourselves be put off by how clunky the words are, because behind the clunkiness, there really is a human experience that is very real, right? And identification with the aggressor, I think really just means, I don't want to, it just means that it's so much easier when we were aggressed against to become strong and fight back than to be the victim. It's a form of survival. And I think it has one of the beautiful things about identification with the aggressor as an explanation for why children who lived with aggression are more likely to become aggressive, is that almost any theory that we have, will predict a similar outcome. So that we can have a social learning theory saying children learn what they observe. And if they are seeing their mother and father, let's say, or their relatives hit each other, and if they see aggression in their community, then the message is, this is the way we're supposed to behave in the world. This is how we deal with being vulnerable, with being disrespected, with being hurt, etc. We protect ourselves by hurting first. And I think that the moment that you are talking about, saying the best defense is an offense, is she is a woman, I believe, that has to think of the world as a dangerous place, so that her first go-to is, how do I protect myself? Otherwise, this wouldn't be the first thing that she's thinking of. But the world is a dangerous place for her in her molecules.
Yes.
Right?
Very much.
It's like it's become embedded. It's almost like a hyperreactive amygdala that is constantly scanning the environment for where will the next source of danger come from. And with what psychoanalysis brings in there is not just that you are learning it as if it were a cognitive or an imitation kind of thing. It's also a conviction that your aggression is justified, that it is egosyntonic, that it's righteous. And that is what makes it a defense, that it is not amenable to reflection about what's hitting this bus driver that didn't stop at the stop sign, so that you at the bus stop, so that you had to run and get in, and then you were taking it as a personal offense. Is this really what happened there? Could it be that he didn't see you? Could it be that, that is not part of what is amenable? And I think that what therapy would do is hopefully playing with other possibilities, and then this idea of that hitting him, that felt so right at the moment, landed you yet again in jail, and yet again gave you the message that you can't belong, that the world is against you. And, I'm thinking of Viktor Frankl, who was a philosopher, a neurologist, a psychiatrist, a Holocaust survivor, and who said, there is a stimulus and there is a response. And between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space is our capacity for growth and freedom. And I think that's what this kind of attitude towards therapy does, right? And that's how we can address identification with the aggressor, as opposed to saying, count till 3, which can also happen. And if it happens and it works, start with simplicity. But if it is, what do you mean stop? That guy really had it coming to him. And then we have to go underneath.
Yeah, I'm thinking also about in the play with the young kids, where they have experienced directly or witnessed violence. Honestly, even if they have not directly witnessed it, but it's in the family, it's part of what's being passed down is this aggression. And the importance of having this possibility of holding identification with the aggressor in mind in the play session, because certainly you've probably all had the experience that a child comes in and they're smashing the cars together with anger, and the parents' response is, oh, be gentle, be nice, right? And so they're worried about their child's aggression. And as therapists, we have choices about a number of different ways we can respond to the child's aggression. And often, in my experience, and at least, is like, I don't know what this means. Is the child afraid of the aggressor? Is the child thoroughly excited about, finally, I get an opportunity to be powerful myself? So the trick of like doing the stage whisper, which you probably already know, like, should I be mad or sad? Right? So asking them to give you some direction about what your role as victim is, so that you can try to tease apart the meaning of the aggression for them in the moment. And it's awful that you sometimes get kids who say, be sad, and they want you to just cry and be so dramatic. This isn't fair, and on, and it doesn't shift for a long time. Then you say, I've been doing this. Do I have to be sad again? I want to be mad. It's my turn to be mad. And, and that's where the play comes in. I was reminded of it because you used that term play. Can you play with this notion of aggression? So that and this is Fonagy again too. So, separating what feels real and essential to the self, and separating it so that it can be thought about. There's just space. Oh, I can watch myself do that, and then maybe have a different decision about it. Mm-hmm. And that's what play brings us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. Thank you for that.
And do we want to stop for questions now? Okay.
Comments, questions? How did it go?
Okay. Here's one here, Alicia. Can you talk a little bit about children taking on their parents' anxiety? Similar to identification with aggressor, but I find it can sometimes be a harder presentation for parents to navigate. So are we thinking here about a child who's mirroring their parents' anxiety through their showing their own anxiety?
It's such an important, yes.
Harder maybe to talk about, it sounds like.
Yes.
Harder for parents to navigate because they feel guilty, maybe.
Anxiety is such a, it's actually one of the things that psychoanalysis brought to the fore, right? All the anxieties. Actually, Freud called all the separation anxiety, anxiety about body damage, anxiety about it. He called them anxieties. We call them fears because they also have an external fuel, whereas anxiety is much more internalized, an internal response. But I think that the identification with the parent's anxiety comes from the parent's sense of basic insecurity in the world, their helplessness about creating safety for themselves and their child, and a sense of tentativeness, of just hesitation, but also true sense of what do I do in this overwhelming world where nobody gave me the resources that I need to cope with the enormous expectations of living and taking care of myself and taking care of a child. And I think that it's almost like by osmosis that babies, because affect is very contagious, isn't it? And the body language gets transmitted, and anxiety really lives in the body. And the baby absorbs it through the tension, through the facial expression, through the eyes, through the tone of voice. It's really non-verbal, that anxiety gets conveyed. And I think that the way that I would like to consider working with a situation like that, and I'd love to, I wish, and I that we have time to talk about this outside, etc., is by helping the parent in the here and now identify what makes them feel so worried. What are the sources of worry? And how can we help alleviate them? Sometimes the worries are so very concrete. People live in very, very dangerous neighborhoods. People have a lot of socioeconomic conditions. There is racism, there is discrimination, there is helplessness, marginalization. And so that's where I think that infant mental health and social justice are inextricably linked, right? We need to understand their circumstances and then also understand the early origins of the anxiety and try to see which one is more salient in the here and now, and then kind of hierarchy of interventions that might affect both, address both the here and now in concrete ways, and also the way that the internalized response, the anxiety towards those circumstances, continues to fuel the sense of self and the relationship. Would you say what do you think? And then talking about how is the baby responding. But I think sometimes by going straight to the baby, the parent feels, yet again, I don't matter. Yet again, it's my baby. It's somebody else. Yet again, my voice, my needs. And then the baby becomes a rival for the love of the therapist. And I think that that is something that we really try to avoid, to help the parent feel that we only care about the baby and we care about them as a vehicle for the baby. I think we really care about both of them and about their relationship. And every intervention, I think, needs to be dual or triple or family, so that people feel that we do not, the intervention that benefits one is not at the expense of the other.
The beauty of the CPP model that really leans into this telling back to the parents, of course, this is the way it is in your family. Of course you feel anxious given what's happened to you. Is so laden with empathy for the parent, and that it starts there, it has to start there, this explanation, so that they then have some internal resource to give to the child.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
So here's a next question that's similar to what you're talking about. This moving into the social frame and what's happening at a larger level. How do you frame identification with the aggressor at the socio-cultural level?
Oh my.
And frankly, I will say, and belie my own politics, but I think that's what's happening in our political world to an extraordinary degree, the amount of violence that's being expressed. And you can see right in front of us how a feeling of helplessness is intolerable, and it must be transformed into violence.
Yes.
For some people.
Right.
Want to say any more about that?
You know, I think the internalization of oppression is something that deserves long, thoughtful, multifaceted conversation. I think that Chandra is going to be talking about that. And it's like the wonderful thing about psychoanalysis, I think, says there is no ultimate truth. There is a range of truths, some of which are more salient at any particular time and are more useful towards healing action at any one particular time. And I think that one thing that we're trying to do, and you're going to hear it, I think, in the case presentations, is the question of how do we integrate social justice activism and anti-racism and dismantling sources of oppression with also an understanding that there are times where we are caught in the enactment of forms of behavior that perpetuate aggression, perpetuate oppression towards somebody else. And in that sense, I think that one of the things that psychoanalysis does is try to get people to come to grips with what are the consequences of their actions, and to what extent are their actions, no matter how justified from an external perspective, actually have the unexpected consequence of continuing a pattern that is actually harmful. And that's where I think that this idea of what is the space between between stimulus and reaction, and
Making more space.
Meaning more space.
Making more space.
Right.
Yeah. How are we doing for time, Anne? 5 minutes? Well, here's a good one for everybody. Any user-friendly psychoanalysis textbooks you would recommend? Textbooks. I don't know about textbooks, but maybe some books and readings would be good.
You know, this will tell you how I have not kept up with the latest literature. There are two classics that I just found so helpful to me. One is Frida from Reichmann, Principles of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, which is so, and I haven't read it for a long time, so I don't know whether if I read it now, I would still feel this sense of, I really understand what you are saying. Thank you for helping me grow that way. But it's in paperback, and it's not very expensive. I think it's really an absolute classic. There is one example I just want to, where she is in a prison talking to a very dangerous woman from behind, right? and the woman is telling her horrible things. And she says, Frida from Reichmann says, I can't let you talk to me that way. And she turns away to leave, and then turns around and sees the woman and says the despair in the woman's face, and realizes at that moment that that woman was feeling confirmed in her conviction that she was just unacceptable, and that there was nobody that was going to stay with her and with her terrible badness. And Frida made herself go back to her and speak to her and got an entry into her pain underneath the aggression. That's the kind of tone that that book has, which I think is worthwhile reading for. And the other one is by Ralph Greenson, Greenson, and one that stands with me in that book is he talks about ask what did it feel like in your body when you were doing that? Keep having the person go further into what their experience was like, and then the person said, oh, I felt like I was asphyxiated. And did you have other experiences of feeling asphyxiated? My father, when I was 9, and then there is an openness to the origins of conflict. So those two books for me have been very, very foundational, and we can do some due diligence and see whether there are newer ones. Thank you for asking.
I'll add, there's a couple of books by a woman named Nancy McWilliams,
Yes.
which are wonderful, very clearly written, beautiful, direct approach to explaining psychoanalytic ideas. She has one on diagnosis and one on treatment, I believe. It's McWilliams.
Thank you for, yes.
So I'd recommend
She's great.
that. She doesn't talk about children really, but I think that it's a wonderful foundational piece. I always recommend Daniel Stern
Yes.
for getting more of the texture of what it might feel like to be a baby, to be inside of a little baby's body and mind and soul. And of course, he has that analytic background and speaks in that way as well.
Mm-hmm.
Who else? Anybody else that from the child side comes to mind? Oh, Erna Furman. We talked about Erna Furman last night. So Erna Furman was an analyst at the Hannah Perkins School in St. Louis. Cleveland, thank you. Her articles are Feeling and Being Felt is a wonderful article. We talked about intermittent decathexis, another ridiculous word, but a wonderful and important idea. So Erna Furman, I would look her up.
And cathexis, I just want to say, just means putting emotional energy into something. That's what cathexis means. And decathexis is withdrawing emotional energy from something. Does it need to be that fancy? No, but that is.
But that article is a fantastic one that is simply about exactly what you're describing. And it's a case study of a little boy whose mother was enormously preoccupied, self-preoccupied, and would attend to him in a loving way in moments, and then completely drop him from mind in other moments, so much so that he walked down the street in his pajamas one night. She didn't miss him. And kind of the emotional impact it had on his development. So, wonderful case piece.
Just want to say, Selma Freiberg supervised me on the case of a 2-year-old who kept running away, kept running away, kept running away. And she said to me, and the mom kept saying, she's just impossible. It was a very rejecting mom. And Selma said to me, this little girl wants to be retrieved. She wants to be told that she's missed. And so go out on the street and ask the mom permission to do what you think is best. And she can decide whether it works for her or not, etc. And then we went out on the street, and the little girl ran away, and I ran after her, and I said, we don't want you to run away. We're so worried that you'll get hurt, and we'll miss you. We want to have you with us. And I brought her back, and she looked at me like, really? And the mom said, we're just spoiling her. And I said, but look at how happy she looks. Do you think that maybe we can just see if it works? It will be one less source of worry for you. Even if it spoils her a little bit. And then that, we got into the question of what did spoiling mean for the mom, and her sense that being given what she wanted was not something that she felt was acceptable.
Wow.
So,
Such a deep grief on her part. So much mourning that needed to happen there. I'm reminded of a quote that Donald Winnicott said that there's, I will mix it up, there's joy, the joy of hiding. There's such joy in hiding and the catastrophe of not being found. That's so much the experience of the toddler.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I think
Thank you.
this draws us to a
Thank
close.
you very much.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you. Thank you.